nostalgia as historiography, Robert Youngson and the compilation films 1957 and 1970.
I'm going to begin with a short video clip to give an idea of some of the films that I'll be talking about.
Turn back with us now. Turn back to a time when the movies were much younger, and like all youthful things, full of fun and high spirits. Down that long, dusty road, the clowns are coming. The great, voiceless, irreplaceable clowns who rock the world with laughter. Most of them are gone, but they have left their shadows behind. So come back with us now. Come back to that time of wonderful nonsense called the Roaring '20s. Come back to the golden age of comedy.
The setting is a movie house of the 1920s. We hear the familiar strains of Chopin's Etude Opus 10 No. 3 as the curtains open across the screen, revealing the words, a Robert Youngson production. For the next 90 minutes, we step back in time to a simpler world. A world that exists only as a memory today, captured and preserved in the silent black and white shadows of celluloid. Between 1957 and 1970, Robert Youngson took audiences back to comedy's golden age, to the era of the great silent clowns, through a series of compilation films that presented carefully selected and skillfully arranged excerpts culled from the troves of great one- and two-reel comedies of the Roaring '20s. His films are at once nostalgic and historic. The American Heritage Dictionary defines nostalgia as, quote, a bittersweet longing for things, persons, or situations of the past, end quote. And Youngson's approach is nothing if not nostalgic. But more than simply being exercises in nostalgia, I want to propose that Youngson's work served as an invaluable service to film historiography, inspiring in his viewers a desire to seek out as many of these silent comedies as they could get their hands on, and to learn about the great performers Youngson showcased in his films. Many silent comedy historians owe a debt to Youngson, along with people like James Agee, John McCabe, Walter Kerr, Paul Killiam, and William K. Everson. He was one of a select few who treated silent comedy with the same respect usually reserved for acknowledged masterworks of world cinema. Youngson, in the words of fan John Brennan, presented the art of silent comedy with respect and dignity, as well as with a sense of humor, and both critics and audiences responded enthusiastically. Before Youngson, on the rare occasions that silent comedies were revived, they were too often presented in chopped-up versions, with painfully unfunny and condescending narration, inappropriate music scores, and generally were held up as antiquated artifacts for audiences to laugh at rather than with. Youngson would change all of that. A former newsreel editor, Youngson developed an interest in cinema's past while selecting clips from silent features in the Warner Brothers library to prepare condensed versions of some of the studio's big hits from the 1920s. It was in 1957 that Youngson would produce the first full-length compilation dedicated to the art of silent comedy. Interest in silent comedy had experienced something of a revival in 1949 thanks to the publication of James Agee's seminal essay, Comedy's Greatest Era, in Life magazine. Prior to publication of this article, silent comedy had largely been ignored by the critical community. Hollywood itself showed little interest in the great silent clowns who had been cast aside during the transition to sound. In the place of the silent clowns had risen a new crop of comedians, with quick verbal humor and musical comedy influenced by their vaudeville and radio backgrounds. It's perhaps no surprise that audiences clamored for the kind of nostalgic trip that Youngson took them on in the golden age of comedy, which received commercial release by Distributors Corporation of America. The film was essentially a large-scale version of the kinds of short compilation reels that Youngson had worked on at Pathé News. His approach involved editing together sequences from a number of silent comedies, selected to represent the best examples of each comedian's work. Youngson wrote narration that would help explain plot details, provide biographical information on the comedians, and historical background on the films themselves. Most important, Youngson's film provided the opportunity to actually see some of the great gags and comic sequences that James Agee had written about in his essay. Youngson's film also rectified a major oversight on Agee's part, giving long overdue attention to the beloved comedy team of Stan Laurel and Oliver Hardy. While Agee's essay had established the silent comedy triumvirate of Chaplin, Keaton, and Lloyd, Youngson was limited in which comedians he could showcase because of copyright issues. Because Chaplin held the copyright for his independently produced features, Youngson could only use clips from the early Keystone and Mutual comedies. Lloyd is totally absent from Youngson's compilations because he maintained such tight control over his films. Among the big three, only Keaton appears extensively in Youngson's films, included in When Comedy Was King and 30 Years of Fun. Certainly no comedians benefited more from the exposure they received through Youngson's work than Laurel and Hardy. The Golden Age of Comedy introduces them with the subtitle, Nobody Loved Them But the Public. A reference to the fact that even though beloved by fans, the team had never received serious critical or scholarly attention. Youngson would change that. Unfortunately, Oliver Hardy had died earlier in 1957 and was thus unable to see the revival of interest in their work brought about by Youngson's film. He devotes the lion's share of the film's 78-minute running time to the boys, highlighting some of their best sequences from a number of their great silent two-reelers made for Hal Roach at the tail end of the 1920s. Beginning in the 1960s, both John McCabe and William K. Everson would be responsible for giving Laurel and Hardy greater critical exposure, but it was Youngson who ignited this renewed interest in their work. In addition to Laurel and Hardy, Youngson would try less successfully to generate new interest in the work of Charlie Chase, as well as lesser-known clowns like Billy Bevan, Vernon Dent, Q.P. Morgan, Edgar Kennedy, and Al St. John. In reviewing the film in the New York Times, Bosley Crowther praised Youngson for his efforts in preserving these films, calling the general lack of concern for film preservation, quote, one of the great cultural tragedies of our time. However, he took Youngson to task for the overly nostalgic tone of his presentation, stating, quote, Mr. Youngson's narrative is for the most part impressionistic, sentimental, and only film deep, so to speak. Youngson's film is indeed impressionistic and sentimental, to use Crowther's words. Despite the fact that the silent era was only about 35 years in the past, Youngson presents it as something out of another world. And in many ways, considering the drastic cultural shifts that had taken place in those intervening years, from the Great Depression to the Second World War, the atomic bomb, and the Cold War paranoia of the 50s, such an attitude was understandable. The film's nostalgic tone is present in the narration throughout. The first segment is introduced as the curtain rises on a clip of a stoical Max Sennett sitting in his desk surrounded by slapstick chaos, while the narrator intones, quote, behind that curtain, the world is 30 years younger. Narrator Ward Wilson introduces a clip from the Sennett comedy Circus Today by stating, quote, the background is a 10-show circus, which, like comedy itself, has almost vanished from the American scene. In the excerpt of the Max Sennett college comedy Run, Girl, Run, the narration notes that, quote, college films were popular in the 20s, when everybody from baby to grandpop wanted to go collegiate. At the end of this sequence, after Carol Lombard has won the big race for Sunnydale College, narrator Dwight Wiest concludes with, quote, soon it will be gone, as the age of flappers and flaming youth is gone. These examples from the narration provide an idea of the kind of nostalgic tone that dominates the film. Youngson's next film, When Comedy Was King, was released in 1960. This one had a much wider release, distributed by 20th Century Fox. Youngson always opened his film with strains of Chopin's Etude Opus 10 No. 3, which became his theme song. The audience is invited to, quote, come chase along with Charlie Chase and family across 30 years of time. And the film opens with a lengthy excerpt from Chase's 1929 comedy, Movie Night. The sequence also serves to provide a nostalgic, albeit comic, look at the movie-going experience of the 20s, as the narration provides a sentimental description of the lost art of silent comedy. Quote, we believe it will make you laugh as loudly as the audiences of so long ago, end quote. And informing the audience that, quote, for the next 90 minutes, you will be part of a world a third of a century younger, end quote. The film's attitudes towards contemporary screen comedy are summed up in the narration, quote, Max Sennett, the old master himself, was to look back at his wacky world of old and wonder, what has happened to laughter? There used to be so much of it. In addition to generating renewed interest in the performers and history of silent comedy, Youngson inadvertently preserved films in the process of including them in his compilations. He sought out the very best material possible. But because he was working on a tight budget, he could only copy the portions of the films that he planned to use in his excerpts. The story of the preservation of the pie fight sequence from Laurel and Hardy's 1927 two-reeler, The Battle of the Century, highlights the importance of what Youngson was doing. Because Youngson only copied what he needed from each film, he could only preserve those sections that he copied for his own personal use. The master print remained in the care of its copyright holder. And unfortunately, according to Richard W. Bann, Herbert R. Gelbspan, then manager of the Hal Roach studio, demonstrated little concern for film preservation. In his article on the restoration of the Battle of the Century, Bann writes, quote, "Robert Youngson was not an archivist. He wasn't intending to do so, but by converting selectively the quickly deteriorating nitrate onto safety film stock, in order to incorporate the footage he wanted for his anthology feature, Youngson preserved it." Shortly after copying the portions he needed, the rest of the print decomposed, and the sections that Youngson used in the Golden Age of Comedy remain the only surviving copies of the celebrated pie fight sequence from that film. What is significant about this story is that it serves as a reminder that all film preservation ultimately represents a set of choices about what is considered worth saving at that particular moment. It is the great lament of film preservationists that they can't save everything. Decisions must be made about the value of this or that film over the other. And at first consideration, Youngson's preservation methods might strike us as hopelessly naive today. He copied only what he wanted for his own projects. While it's easy to view this as a crass commercial decision, it's important to note that without the work of people like Youngson to rejuvenate interest in silent film, there would be even less effort to preserve these films properly today, and far less would exist. And in the case of the Battle of the Century, as Richard W. Bann notes, it was ultimately the responsibility of the film's owner, Hal Roach Studios, to preserve the film. Their lack of concern is apparent in the fact that the film was already heavily damaged by decomposition when Youngson came across it. And the rest of the print deteriorated beyond salvation shortly after Youngson copied what he needed. Between 1961 and 1970, Youngson would release 6 more compilations celebrating the bygone era of the silent screen. After his death in 1974, Youngson's collection of film prints was sold by his widow to a number of collectors, including William K. Everson, Gordon Burkow, and Herb Graff. The advent of home video would render the compilation format obsolete, since viewers could now own and watch the entire films rather than watching them in excerpts. Collections like the Slapstick Encyclopedia allow viewers to watch in their entirety many of the same films Youngson had excerpted in his compilations. Yet without Youngson, it is debatable whether or not the interest in silent comedy would be strong enough to create a demand for such collections. Robert Youngson left behind a legacy of films that expressed, above all, his enthusiasm for their subject matter. He educated and informed a whole generation of film buffs, and through his careful selection of highlights from comedy's golden age, introduced the films of the great clowns to new audiences. At a time when the art of silent comedy was viewed by many as little more than a crude, antiquated entertainment from a bygone age, Youngson almost single-handedly rejuvenated interest in this most unique of American art forms. We are in Youngson's debt for his willingness to proclaim the historical importance of these works at a time when they were all too frequently dismissed out of hand. He argued his case for these films eloquently and passionately through his compilation work. Out of the generations of young people who received their first exposure to silent comedy through Youngson's films have risen a passionate, dedicated group of historians and scholars who have followed in Youngson's footsteps, preserving our comic past and continuing in turn to introduce new audiences to the work of the silent clowns. Above all, that is the most important part of Youngson's legacy, the ability to inform and inspire future generations to explore the work of the great clowns who brought happiness to millions around the world during the golden age of comedy. In the words of Robert Youngson himself, conveyed in the closing narration of the golden age of comedy, quote, "The curtain lowers, the clowns depart, hail and farewell. We will never see their like again. This is the end of a memory." And I will now close with the pie fight sequence from the Battle of the Century that Youngson was responsible for preserving.
Battle of the Century. Demonstrated a rule of natural science. If someone slips on a banana peel, innocent Oliver is sure to be holding a banana. the Face had been originated by Max Sennett in the earliest days of his Keystone comedies. By 1928, when this film was made, it had become a movie cliché to be avoided by the better comedy makers. Then Hal Roach produced a pie-throwing comedy to top all pie-throwing comedies. One in which every little pie had a meaning all its own, and an essentially simple act was endowed with infinite variety, like the variations on a theme in a symphony. In short, the pie-throwing comedy triumphant. This is it.
So it's not back to follow, I guess, but Anthony Blood is going to present